Over the last year, I have spent hundreds of hours replaying every single main series Pokemon game. And now that we've hit 50,000 subscribers, it's finally time for me to re-rank every main series Pokemon game from worst to best. And in dead last, being the worst mainline Pokemon game ever, is still Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl.
How could you do this to us again? You deserve substantially worse.
To be completely transparent, I did enjoy this more my second time around than my first, but that doesn't mean it's a good remake. There are some good things here, like the underground being a way better version of what it was in the original, almost to the point where it feels like there's an entire new region existing underneath Sinnoh. And the trainer battles got a rework, so especially towards the end part of the game, they can be pretty difficult, with Cynthia in particular being one of, if not the hardest trainer battles in the entire series. And it was nice to see some level of challenge in any of the modern Pokemon titles. And of course, having the ability to customize outfits is always going to be a good change. But outside of those few things, this is just Diamond and Pearl, but somehow worse. The game just looks really bad. I know this was a faithful remake made by a side studio that was trying to replicate the original style, but going for a 3D chibi art style just looks rough. If they went for an HD 2D style, or even what they had with the Let's Go games, I'm sure it would look great. But whether it's the characters or the environments themselves, everything just looks really bad. Outside of the things I listed before, the other changes were just really poorly done. Like in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you have the ability to walk with Pokemon. But unlike there, where it was groundbreaking, here it is just so lazy. So many of the Pokemon are so poorly animated that walking around with them looks terrible. And this being a true faithful remake almost made this a copy and paste of Diamond and Pearl, along with all the flaws that came with it. The selection of Pokemon is horrid, and there is a staggering lack of electric and fire types in the entire region. So much so that Volkner and Flint have a bunch of filler Pokemon on their teams because there weren't enough in the region to make it fit. A subtle issue that they had fixed in Platinum, but for some reason didn't do here. I know this was a remake of Diamond and Pearl and not Platinum, so it didn't have to have all of the story changes, though that would have been nice. But it seems like a no-brainer to fix the long-standing issues that people had with those games. But leaving these the way they are feels even lazier than this remake already was. When every other remake has been more substantial both in content and variety, dating all the way back to Fire Red and Leaf Green on the Game Boy Advance, this was just really sad to see. It was just a great way to cash in on the nostalgia that I and a lot of people were feeling towards Sinnoh at the time. And it was a safe way for them to hedge their bets with Arceus coming out shortly after. But after replaying every single game in the series, this is still the worst. Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu are not bad games, and in a lot of ways, they are far from it. But they are also way too simple to enjoy for anybody who's been a fan of the series for longer than a year. This was designed to be a great pipeline for people who had not played the series in a while to get back into it. So a lot of the features that were added in earlier entries like abilities, wild Pokemon battles, and held items got removed. And some new things like the Pokemon Go style catching mechanic were added in their place. Now I have no problem for Pokemon using this as a way to bring in new fans because honestly it's a good idea. It somewhat retells the original story from Red, Blue, and Yellow, but this time it has a lot of changes like new protagonists, which to be fair, are a lot worse, but end up still being fine enough. And along your journey, you get to see older versions of characters from the original games. You get to retrace the journey of the original titles, all while getting the most visually impressive Pokemon game of all time. Which is wild because this was also the first one to come to a home console.
We did a good job this time. Yeah, we did great. Do you want to make every other game look like absolute trash? You know it.
The way they took the original layout of Kanto but made it look so refreshing was great to see. Even if you hadn't played a Pokemon game since the originals, you could pick up and play this with little to no challenge. And finally modernizing the way that Pokemon encounters work was a great idea. Instead of the random encounters the series was known for, this time you could just see a Pokemon in the overworld and you could walk up and battle it whenever you want. This made it so much easier to track down a specific Pokemon you were looking for to complete the Pokédex or just to shiny hunt in general. And even though this did a lot of things right, it is just really boring to play with all of these features removed. The game would be so much better if they just gave you the option to turn off these new features and play the game like it was in every other title. That way, it would still serve as the transitionary title it was meant to be, while also giving long-term fans of the series a reason to play this more than once. But as it stands, unless I'm hunting a specific shiny Pokemon, I can't see a reason to play this version of Kanto over any of the others. Now, I promise this list isn't going to be a nostalgia blind rant on why new games are bad and old games are good. However, Sword and Shield were just lacking in a lot of areas that could have made them so much better. When I first played this, I liked it a lot, and I still do. But now with some distance from the release, I see a lot more of the subtle issues that I didn't notice at first. Graphically, I don't think it looks bad, but it also doesn't look good. Some of the locations look genuinely great, which only makes the ones that don't look so much worse. You can tell this was made as a transitionary title to see if they could make the Pokemon formula work in an open environment. So half of the game keeps the standard towns and routes this series was known for, while the other half tries to make an open world, but neither of them ended up nailing the format they were going for. While there are locations that look genuinely great, there are also some towns and routes that are painfully bland. And somehow the story is the exact same way. There's no villain organization, which is fine. Team Yell doesn't really count, and even if they did, they were just groupies for Marnie and her brother, so they were fine. But the whole overarching conflict with Chairman Rose did not make a lick of sense. Apparently, the Galar region is on the brink of an energy crisis, if by brink you mean in 1,000 years. So naturally, Chairman Rose has to fix it immediately, using a legendary Pokemon that he just sort of has. They never explain what kind of energy he needs or why it's such a pressing matter that it has to be done now and not in 1,000 years when it's going to be an actual problem. And not only that, there were multiple times throughout the story where there would be something monumental going down that you would hear about through dialogue. Why would they not allow you to be there for these things? It just seems like they had a loose idea for a story and then just stapled a bunch of notes together to make whatever this was. And once you beat the main story, there was a small side story with these two weenies that wraps it up. But other than doing raid battles, there really wasn't any post-game to be seen. That is, of course, unless you buy the DLC, which is wild. Pokemon post-games were a standard practice, and as soon as they start releasing DLC, they mysteriously disappeared. And even before that, Dexit was a tragedy, being the first titles that made it so you were not guaranteed to be able to use your favorite Pokemon in some capacity. And finally, the characters like Hop and Leon were fine, but again, because of the story's poor writing, were never given a chance to really shine like they could have. Hop had a great premise, being the little brother of a champion who had something to prove. And Leon was a much more grounded champion that was tied into the story well, but he never got a chance to do anything memorable. The main gimmick of Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing was a cool premise, but gameplay-wise was a bit of a letdown. Dynamaxing allowed your Pokemon to get large and use stronger versions of their existing moves, while Gigantamaxing at least gave these Pokemon new forms akin to Mega Evolutions, but overall, the only cool part about how these were implemented was into the gyms, which I think is hands down the best part of this game. The puzzles inside of them were solid and gave each of the gyms their own reason to exist, but the gym setting, being an open arena full of people, looked great. No gym challenge before or since has replicated the same level of scale that these battles had. And when you add on the fact there wasn't a traditional Elite Four and the end game was the equivalent of a tournament that you could replay over and over, was really cool. Though it was a little disappointing there were no Elite Four equivalent trainers anywhere in the region, being able to replay this tournament-style gauntlet with all of these cool gym leaders was one of my favorite parts of this game. And though a lot of people seem to dislike it, I think the wild area was a good addition too. Having all of the Pokemon be in a large natural habitat was a good idea, and the way the weather impacted the different sections was a nice touch. Though it never really made sense that in one spot it could be a perfectly sunny day, but if you move over 2 feet, it's a blizzard, I think it was a good idea to take this area and give it more variety than it would have had on its own. But again, I wish they would have taken it a step further. Instead of separating the world into a bunch of small areas that have weather differences, turn them into biomes that have different populations of Pokemon and look visually distinct. The entirety of the original wild area looks the exact same. And though the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra look a little bit better, none of them look like they were made with care. Overall, I think Sword and Shield are decent games and can be a lot of fun. They have a solid Pokemon formula at their core, but with a bad story and a lackluster postgame, I can't think of a reason to play this over most of the other entries. It really pains me to put Pokemon Sun and Moon so low on this list, but compared to every other Pokemon game I've played, this was by far the hardest to go back to. The Alola region is such a nice area and is a perfect fit for the series. Getting to jump between multiple islands, all with their own distinct themes, was a great idea. And the fact that this was the first game to introduce a regional variant of a Pokemon, a new idea that I have loved in every subsequent entry, was even better. And it is just a shame that the game itself is paced like a snail moving through wet cement. The amount of unskippable cutscenes and long drawn out dialogue sequences is unbearable. Watching Hao or any of the trial captains speak for minutes on end without saying anything of substance was honestly impressive. Though outside of the pacing issues, when the story was good, it ended up being really good. Whether it was the Aether Foundation researching wormholes or Team Skull taking over towns because its members failed the island challenge, both parties helped make a story that was already good be told even better. And it's just a shame that getting this far in the game takes a lot of patience. Outside of the regional variants, of course, the standard Pokédex was pretty solid. Most of the new Pokemon really leaned into the island theme they were going for, and I really like that.
But didn't they introduce Komala in this region? Never mind, this is the worst one. Bring it back. Alright.
The idea of having the island challenge was a good one, even though this is just a diet version of the normal gym challenge. But because it fit with the region design and it changed just enough to make it stand out from other entries, I think it was a good enough change. Now, this didn't affect where it ended up placing, but this was also the first game to introduce Z moves, effectively throwing out the idea of new Mega Evolutions for this wet pile of trash. I think having a new gimmick for every Pokemon generation was a good idea if you were in a boardroom. They were attempting to make each region feel distinct from the ones that came before it. But this also made it very overcomplicated and too different between each region, while also getting rid of something that most people genuinely enjoyed with Mega Evolution. To be fair, they were still available in this game, which was nice. But the fact that there were no new ones in favor of these dance moves was a weird choice. I think that Sun and Moon had some great concepts, but ultimately were constricted by all the fluff that made the games feel so slow. And I can see why a lot of people hold these games in such a high regard, but I'm always going to prefer to go back to the other versions. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet somehow managed to be the most divisive Pokemon game that has ever released. This, unlike Sword and Shield, was a full open world that was a leap forward for the series that I personally wanted to see attempted, but now that I've seen it, I think I'm all good. An open world Pokemon game is a really cool idea and something that I have always wanted, but for some reason the developers are not given the resources they would need to make this really work, and Pokemon succeeds the most with the linear structure it had in all of the past entries. It gave them more control of the experience and let them structure a better adventure so it felt more intentional. Because here, the towns feel like they were added as an afterthought. Most of these locations are just a bunch of houses scattered about with a Pokemon gym, but since there are almost no buildings to enter in the entire game, there's not really a reason to go to these locations after you've gone to the gyms. I know legally, Pokemon was a little bit bold with the whole break into someone's house without permission thing, but there should have been something to see in these towns outside of the main one, which even then, it is big, but it's still really bland. If there was a way to incorporate the depth from the town that we saw in older entries, then I think this would work really well. But I can't think of a way for them to do this while also achieving the seamless open world they're going for. Gameplay-wise, they separated the main story into 3 distinct paths. In one, you're fighting the standard gym challenge, in another, you're taking down Team Star, and in the last, you're making sandwiches for a sick dog.
This is by far the best part of the game.
It gave each of the main 3 friends a reason to exist, and the story for the most part was decent. And it's just a shame that Team Star has little to no reason to exist, as it is both the worst part of this game in the story and gameplay wise. And up until the ending in Area Zero, I thought the story overall was just fine. It was definitely better than Sword and Shield, so at least there was some level of progress, but just like those games, unless you bought the DLC, there really wasn't a post-game. To be fair, the DLC here was the best DLC that Pokemon has ever gotten, telling a connected story about Kieran and his sister that is honestly better than anything we got in the base game, and I just wish the same writers who worked on this story also worked on the one that was told in the main game. Now, the biggest problem here is that the state this game released in was beyond horrid. When it was released, people were saying that Legends EA was the worst looking Pokemon game to ever come out. But all of the visuals here look like they were made by the interns. The characters themselves looked fine, but most of the world was so barren it was just bland to look at. Of course, there were some exceptions of locations that did look pretty good, but for the most part, all of this was just open fields with patches of Pokemon here and there. Now that there's a Switch 2 version, a lot of the performance issues have been pushed to the side. There are definitely still some hiccups here and there, but at least it runs at a decent level. But the saving grace here is that this has the best gameplay gimmick since Mega Evolutions. Now, to be fair, terrestrializing looks really stupid, but gameplay-wise, this enhanced the strategy of battle by allowing you to change your Pokemon's type on the fly. and this added a fun level of complexity that made competitive Pokemon more fun than it had been in a very long time. So all in all, the story here was just alright, the performance on the Switch 2 is at least passable, but the battle mechanics were the best the series had seen in a very long time. And what really stinks is that this is the second best selling game in the entire franchise, which means a lot of people who did play this played it on the original Switch, which meant that they were experiencing Pokemon at a very low point. Pokemon X and Y were the first games that brought the series into 3D. Fittingly, they did so on the 3DS, and though I don't really love this change, I get why they did it. They really wanted to show off the power of the 3DS, so now that they had the option to make the game look more impressive, they went for it. And though this looks fine, I just prefer the art style of the older titles to this. Of course, there were a bunch of other new changes that came to the formula as well. The introduction of the fairy type helped rebalance the rock, paper, scissors formula the series was known for, and of course, the introduction of Mega Evolutions became a fan favorite from here on out. This did create the issue of having to build a whole team around a certain Pokemon you wanted to Mega Evolve, but still the addition was really fun. The Mega Pokemon themselves look really cool for the most part, and they tie into the story pretty well. The story itself was alright, but compared to the other entries in the series before it, it was a little bit bland. You have a large group of friends and you're going on a gym challenge, and of course, there's an enemy organization that's trying to destroy the world. They set up a really cool premise with a historic Pokemon war and ancient Pokemon weapons of mass destruction. But then they proceed to not elaborate on it any further. Team Flare mostly exists just to be a nuisance without any substance. For years, Lysander was the poster boy of wasted potential for the Pokemon series. He never had a reason for being a villain outside of looking like one, but with the release of Pokémon Legends ZA, we finally got the reasons that he built Team Flare, and honestly, it makes the game a lot more fun to revisit. But just because they added a lot of context over a decade later doesn't mean it's excusable for them to have not included it in the original games. Don't get me wrong, something is absolutely better than nothing here, but it's just a shame they had all of these great ideas for a story and then didn't elaborate on it any further. I think the Kalos region itself is decently well designed. There are some cool places like Lumio City and Shabano Castle that I actually liked exploring, and though it definitely lacks some of the visual variety other games in the series had, I don't think this looks bad. And if Pokemon X and Y were given more development time or a deluxe version that hammered out a lot of the issues they had, I feel like this could have been up there with the best of the best. But with all of the plot holes, I can see why a lot of people look at this as the biggest missed opportunity in the entire series. Though they ended up releasing at a very stupid time, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are the games I reach for when I want to replay the region. I don't really know what to label this as because it's not really a deluxe version. It's more like they took the second draft of the story and just remade the game with that. It's more or less the same adventure with a few minor tweaks and a brand new postgame. The first half of the story is pretty much the exact same. You're a soon-to-be Pokemon trainer who moves to the region, gets a starter Pokemon, and begins their attempt at the Island Challenge. Most of the enemies and characters you meet are also the same, but now there's a bigger focus on Ultra Wormholes and how those affect the world around you. I don't really love this change to the story because it makes it overall worse, but they more than made up for it with the additional content that makes replaying this region so much better. They massively extended the Pokédex and even added a few new Pokemon, along with slightly fixing the pacing at certain points in the story. They added whole new features like Mantine surfing, which is weird but also really fun, and of course added a much bigger and better post-game involving Team Rainbow Rocket.
Knowing Pokemon, this has to be innuendo. I just need to prove it.
This post-game was the perfect amount of fan service for anyone who has played any of the older Pokemon titles. Getting to see the heads of all of the evil organizations in the series past come together to just be the worst was a really cool idea, and I would put this up there as one of the best post-games in the entire series. This time around, having a much larger selection of Pokemon made it so all of the battles in the game were much more interesting. You didn't have to worry about a lot of the trainers having the exact same Pokemon. And this added variety on its own made getting through the game far more engaging. And though I don't love the narrative changes to the story, I do think the focus on wormholes did allow for one of the best battles in Pokemon history, where you get to take on Ultra Necrozma. This is not only one of the most difficult battles in the entire franchise, it is also my favorite legendary battle in any Pokemon game ever. Pokemon Sun and Moon absolutely should have had more substantial changes than what they already did. But as it stands, if I ever want to go back and replay Alola Alola again, this is the game I'm going to do it on. When Legends ZA released, it was immediately criticized by everyone on the internet for some valid reasons, and also a lot of reasons I don't really get. Sure, the game should absolutely look better, but if you just looked at the reviews from Twitter, you would think this game was the cause of World War IV.
I think you meant World War III. No, this was so severe, they ended up skipping that one.
The central focus of the game revolves around you stopping the rogue Mega Evolution crisis that is taking place in Lumiose City, which means that you are stuck in Lumiose for the entire game. And I really don't mind this as much as some people did, because the titles prior to this were Scarlet and Violet, games that took place in a massive land full of nothing, so to get a city that had some sort of actual depth was really nice. Of course, the most substantial change came to the battle system, turning every battle into a real-time fight that changed every mechanic in the series' history. Everything from moves to how you use them to the positioning of your Pokemon was important, and it made every battle feel more alive and more interesting. Now, as much as I do like this as a change of pace from the series past, I would prefer if Pokemon kept their roots as a turn-based RPG for most of their games going forward, but if they wanted this to be the gameplay style for all of the Legends games, then I wouldn't care. I think the overall story was pretty good. Having to solve the Mega Evolution crisis that's taking over the city was an interesting way to tell the story. There was no big bad villain organization to rely on who's trying to destroy the world. It just showed a bunch of people in the city who were having different perspectives on how to fix this issue. And getting to interact with them and see their perspectives on how to fix the issue was a better story than I thought they were going to tell. The city itself has a good amount of depth, though I wish it had more. There are clothing shops, Pokemon centers, cafes, and wild zones that all exist inside the city. But these are really the only places that have anything substantial to interact with. The best part of this, in my opinion, are the wild zones where you catch Pokemon. As you progress further in the game, more become available, and this was a good way to add a solid sense of progression that makes the entire game feel more naturally paced. The clothing shops are pretty good and give a lot of customization options for how you can make your character look, something that I personally love playing around with even though it doesn't have any in-game effects. But outside of the wild zones and doing some clothes shopping, the only other thing that exists is exploring the rooftops. And though these are pretty cool and add a lot more surface area to explore, if you want to, you can see all of the city in about 30 minutes. The city does change slightly as the story progresses, which is nice, but after seeing it all relatively quickly, I just wanted more to explore. Outside of the main story, there was plenty to do, whether it was the ZA Royale to battle trainers and get money, or the over 120 side missions that made this game have any amount of depth. Being generous, I think about half of these missions were at all worth my time. Most of them ended up just being a simple battle or a thinly veiled fetch quest. But having completed them all, I don't regret doing it, but I also don't think I'll ever do it again, which is a perfect way to summarize my experience playing this game. It was a great change of pace, and I genuinely love that Pokemon was trying something new here. But unlike most of the other games in the series, I don't see myself coming back to replay this because it just didn't have enough going on. I do see a lot of the problems that people were saying, and I understand people's reservations about getting this game. But I also think a lot of the hate was just overblown for the sake of controversy. And though I don't think this is the best game in the series, I do think it has a lot of charm, and if you're someone who plays a lot of Pokemon games, this is a refreshing change of pace. And I would love for them to take this idea and make it bigger and bolder for their next attempt in the future. As somebody who grew up playing Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, I have a soft spot for the original versions. But that being said, revisiting this is extremely hard to do. Now, similar to Sun and Moon and Legends ZA, I like these games a lot. But the major point that puts this lower on the list is that this is not a game I want to replay. Being the first games in the series available on the DS, this introduced a lot of changes that would affect the series going forward. It was the first game that had dual screen gameplay, online functionality, and introduced the physical and special split for the first time ever. The physical and special split is a change that I could talk about for hours because of how impactful it was, but even just the shift to introducing the touchscreen and adding Wi-Fi connectivity were enough to change how people experienced Pokemon all over the world. You no longer needed to be near the people that you were trading with. You could just put a Pokemon in the global trade station and just hope that somebody would trade with you while you were asleep, which made filling out the Pokédex for the average person so much easier. The story here was still really good, even though this was not the best version of it. Team Galactic is up there with the best organizations in Pokemon history because they were the first that actively was trying to destroy the entire universe. And compared to the other regions we had previously, the Sinnoh region was massive. If you wanted to walk from one side to the other, it would take a pretty long time, which is partly due to one of this game's biggest issues being the pacing of the game. Now, I'm not talking about how the story plays out, I'm literally talking about how fast this game runs, because it is very, very slow.
To be fair, I would rather it be slow than look like that. Still gives me night terrors.
This is the main reason that these games are so low, because the overall story is still pretty good even though there's a better one, but the gameplay speed is so low that whenever I go back and play this, I just want to stop after about an hour. It genuinely took me 3 attempts to start playing through this game because every time I would start, I would put it down after a little bit because it was just a pain to get through. And of course, just like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, it had the issue of the bad Pokemon selection and the over-reliance on HMs that made navigating Sinnoh difficult for the sake of being difficult. But for the era it came out in, Diamond and Pearl are still pretty good games. The jump to the DS was a massive leap in technology that didn't make a lot of sense at the time. Having a system with 2 screens doesn't seem like it's the most brilliant idea in the world, but then again, it's sold like hotcakes, so who am I to judge? But even though it has its performance issues, I still think that Diamond and Pearl are a classic for a reason. And as a massive fan of the region, I'm just glad that this isn't the last time we're gonna see Sinnoh on the list. Now, I know that these are not only the first, but also the best-selling games in the entire series, and for a lot of people who were around for it, this was the pinnacle of the craze that took over the world in the late 90s, but as somebody who got to experience this just a few years after, I totally get the appeal of Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow, but I also think that these are hard to go back to for the average person. The main problem here is that these games feel pretty dated by comparison to every other entry in the entire series. Personally, I don't find the graphics to be a problem at all because this released on the original Game Boy. If you expected anything other than this, then you are insane. But the main problem for me is the dated UI for the menus and bag that make it not only hard to navigate, but also needlessly tedious. There was a limit to how many items you could hold at any time, which I guess makes sense because backpacks aren't full of unlimited space, but always having to juggle what items you could have on you at any time was so annoying. And it would slow the game to a complete stop to play a short round of Inventory Management Simulator. And the insane amount of other bugs and exploits that are in this game could be seen as an issue, but honestly I think that is most of this game's charm. You can break this game really easily, and create conditions that would only be obtainable by using cheat codes in other titles. Whether it was getting a level 100 Nidoking at the very start of the game, or the infamous missing no glitch which people have abused for generations at this point, the spaghetti code that makes up this game is honestly one of the best parts. The balance here is also strange but in a charming way. Because of both special attack and special defense being combined into one stat, there was the problem that psychic types were absolutely busted. You could get through most of this game with a Jinx or a Kadabra without breaking a sweat. And though for a lot of people this could be considered a problem, I think it's a good look back on how much the series has progressed from this point. The story here is an absolute classic with the journey of Red and Blue becoming Pokemon champions and somehow defeating Team Rocket after only being trainers for 2 days. And in Pokemon Yellow, they even included a lot of anime-specific references that made it feel like you were living Ash's journey. These are games that I think everybody should play. I wouldn't blame someone if this was too old for them to go and enjoy, because the dated mechanics, balance, and visuals can be a bit jarring if you don't have nostalgia for the series, but these are still a delightful glitchy mess that are still beloved for a good reason.
Now, if they could just add these to Switch Online, that would be great!
Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were inside of my Game Boy Advance for most of 2003, and I put so many hours into these games that my family was concerned for my long-term mental health. The Hoenn region is tied for my favorite region in the entire series, and though these versions have their quirks, I still think they are very solid entries. Having games that told different stories that were entirely disconnected from the first 2 generations was a good idea. As much as I've always wanted a game that brings you throughout the entire interconnected Pokemon world similar to what they had in Kanto and Johto with every region, I wouldn't want to sacrifice the idea of getting new regions that tell their own unique stories. And having this be a split release that tells 2 different stories from the perspectives of different teams made it actually worth it for the first time to play through both versions of a split release. Team Magma and Team Aqua take on a leading role depending on what version you're playing. And though each version just has one team steamroll the other, I'm glad they had a region that actually attempted to tell a different story. even if both teams are just different flavors of the same insane person. Being the first games in a new generation, they also introduced a bunch of cool new features like double battles, natures and abilities, and weather effects that made battles feel even better. Of course, being on the Game Boy Advance, these were the first games to have a full spectrum of color, and with all of these changes put together, this was the first time that Pokemon ever had a true next generation experience. And there were even some weird minor changes as well. Things like the new secret bases and Pokemon contests were new additions that gave you something to do other than battle and catch Pokemon. Neither of these were the most substantial changes in the world, but they were enough to make this feel like a natural evolution for the series. Like other early entries in the series, it did have the issue with a lot of overuse of HMs, especially water-based ones, which meant that you were pretty much forced to have 1 or 2 Pokemon that were water types on your team for the entire game, alongside some pacing issues, particularly towards the middle of the game that just felt weird and out of place. The first 5 gyms fly by in just a few hours, then the last 3 take almost twice as long to complete than the first 5 did. This is also because you're dealing with either Tweedledee or Tweedledum, but it just feels weird to progress at such a fast pace just to hit a grinding halt about halfway through. And of course, they are missing some quality of life changes that were added in later entries like the physical and special split, but ultimately this still feels like a good Pokemon experience. And don't even get me started on the new Pokemon that were added to the region being some of the best in the entire franchise. No matter how many times I have played through Hoenn, I can always find a way to change up my team to be a little bit different than my last playthrough. And this, alongside a healthy dose of nostalgia, is something that keeps me coming back time and time again to play one of my favorite regions of all time. Unlike Diamond and Pearl and Sun and Moon, sometimes I'll actually go back and play Ruby or Sapphire. And even though I would say these are the worst versions of the story, that doesn't mean they're a bad time at all. Pokemon Gold and Silver were the perfect sequels to Pokemon Red and Blue. They not only expanded the Pokemon world with a new region, new Pokemon, and major gameplay innovations, but they also included the entire first region as a second playable location, doubling the amount of gym badges to collect from any game in the franchise that we have seen since. Now, just like Ruby and Sapphire, this has the issue of having multiple better versions that exist, so going back to play these seems somewhat irrelevant. But when going back and replaying all of these games, these were the titles that surprised me the most with how much I genuinely enjoyed them. And it's a shame that these legitimately solid games have been cast aside by their successors. Johto as a region thrives off environmental storytelling, which is a really nice way of saying the main story is just okay. The remnants of Team Rocket are trying to get the band back together and find their boss Giovanni. And because this is a direct sequel to Red, Blue, and Yellow, this feels more like an extension to that story than a good one on its own. But the real charm here came from exploring the region itself. Whether it was the Burn Tower or the Bellsprout Tower, I had a blast seeing all of the areas that made Johto feel unique. The upgrades to the formula were also really nice, rebalancing all of the things that made Red and Blue so wonky. They introduced Dark and Steel as types, they split special attack and special defense into their own stat groups, and they introduced held items which all made battles feel more engaging. And the new Pokemon here may not have been the most substantial additions, only adding 100 new Pokemon, but considering there was so much content in this game, I didn't mind reusing a lot of Pokemon that I used in Kanto. Getting to see Gold and Silver's journey was just as good as Red and Blue's. And there was something about going through 16 different gyms, the Elite Four, and 2 full regions that made this a blast to revisit. And though there are better versions out there, I think this is one of the most underrated Pokemon adventures in the modern day. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green are Kanto at its absolute finest. Being a faithful remake of the original Pokemon games Red and Green, this made Red's journey more accessible for everybody going forward. The visual overhaul to look as good as Ruby and Sapphire was a great change on its own, bringing Kanto to life like never before. And the changes to the battle system, bringing natures and abilities alongside double battles to these titles, made this both great for new players and people who were revisiting Kanto for the first time in a while. But of course, like most Pokemon remakes, this introduced a good amount of new content. A whole new location known as the Sevi Islands were added to be a more substantial part of the game, and especially the postgame, bringing a much larger selection of Pokemon to the region that weren't available before. And they set an incredibly high bar for all Pokemon remakes going forward. It's the same story, gyms, and characters, except this time around there are not as many game-breaking bugs that make this feel like a light gust of wind from resetting all of your progress. And though I think the bugs in the original help with the game's charm, there is no way to argue that this is the more polished adventure. Kanto has always been the Pokemon Company's golden child. If they are ever worried about a game succeeding, they can just throw some Kanto Pokemon in there and call it a day. And these are fan favorites for a ton of good reasons. And though I have a soft spot for the originals, this is by far the best way to experience what Kanto has to offer. Pokémon Crystal was the first deluxe version to change a substantial amount of the experience from the earlier entries. This was just Gold and Silver with more. There were Pokémon animations, the ability to play as a male or female character. They extended the story to have a whole section that focuses on Suicune's journey. To be fair, this wasn't the most substantial addition. I don't think that anyone would say that Pokémon Crystal has the best story of any Pokémon game, but adding Hisui and Suicune gave this a story that stands on its own, instead of having to rely on what they did in Red, Green, and Blue. And of course, all of the things that made Gold and Silver so good are here as well. Whether it was the day and night cycle, Pokemon breeding, or the ability to experience 2 full Pokemon regions, after the release of Pokemon Crystal, there really wasn't a reason to go back and play the originals. Now, because this was the first deluxe version, it also has the least amount of content changes, so a lot of the things that people were complaining about in Gold and Silver, like the poor difficulty curve, or the over-reliance on Kanto as a whole, were not really fixed here. They were more so just painted over to make it look like a more impressive game. So I could see somebody who bought this at the time expecting a bigger change to be pretty disappointed. But now that it's been a few decades since it released, I think this is the best game to go back and experience the early days of Pokemon. Now I just want to clarify, though it changed a lot, Pokémon Legends Arceus is officially a main series Pokemon game.
But these don't count apparently? I don't make the rules.
Pokémon Legends Arceus was the largest change to the Pokémon structure that a game has ever attempted. Unlike every other Pokémon game that takes place in modern times, this time you are bound back to the past by God himself. You wake up in an ancient version of Sinnoh known as Hisui, and you have to learn how to live in that world, which is very different than the Pokémon world that we know today. You join the Galaxy Expedition team and work alongside a bunch of other trainers to figure out why a giant portal has opened over the sky. And to do so, you fill out the first Pokédex.
No matter how different things get, some things never change.
Pokemon battles themselves remained relatively the same. Unlike Legends EA, these are still turn-based, though they did add a new feature with Agile Style and Strong Style being different variations on how a Pokemon will use a move. But the biggest changes came to how you catch and encounter Pokemon, which is very different and a ton of fun. Unlike a regular Pokemon game where there's random encounters or you walk into a Pokemon and start a battle, in Legends Arceus, it is on-site. Pokemon will either turn and run away, or turn and try and maim you, and given what I know about the Pokemon world, this just makes more sense. The world is broken up into a couple open areas that you get to explore. Each zone is like its own little biome, having its own weather, environments, and Pokemon that make up that population. In these areas, there are regular Pokemon and alpha versions which are bigger and a lot more dangerous. And of course, as you play the main story, you get to battle a bunch of noble Pokemon where you have to throw bags at them for some reason. It's supposed to calm them down and stun them so you can attack. I feel like that would only make them a lot more upset, and I can understand for a lot of people that Pokémon Legends Arceus might have changed too much. By adding crafting mechanics and having a lack of a traditional game structure like gym battles, these changes piled up to make this feel a lot less like a traditional Pokemon game, and it's far different than what the series was known for. But this was also the first Pokemon game that felt like it aged up with its audience. All of these new mechanics and the fact that Pokemon will try and kill you made this feel like a more adult experience. And in my opinion, I want more Pokemon games to take as much creative liberty as this one did. And though I still think that Legends ZA was good, I think that this was a better experience. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire greatly exceeded my expectations for what they were going to be. I don't dislike X and Y, but after it released, I was feeling that Pokemon was losing its way a bit. And maybe it's because I am a Hoenn fanboy, but this was exactly what I wanted. The journey you go on and the Hoenn region itself remain mostly the same. There are some minor tweaks here and there to make things make sense, like redoing an entire city into a mall.
You know, it's called Mallville. They really should have changed it to Mallville. Will you shut up?
But the main journey you go on is mostly the same. Team Magma and Team Aqua are still screwing things up for everybody around. And depending on what version you're playing, one team absolutely dominates the other. And though it's mostly the same, I'm glad they tweaked a few things here and there to make the experience feel somewhat different. But of course, outside of the visuals, the biggest change came to the gameplay. This, releasing during Generation 6, had a big focus on Mega Evolution, not only carrying over all of the new Mega Evolutions that were introduced in X and Y, but also having a bunch of their own, including all of the starters getting their own Mega forms. I get for a lot of people, this made the game a little too easy, but there was something about the rumor mill before release of what Pokemon would and wouldn't be getting a new Mega form that made me even more hyped for the game than I already was. Of course, alongside this, all of the other changes that had been introduced from Ruby and Sapphire up until X and Y were added here, alongside some exclusive mechanics like the Dex Nav, which made hunting Pokemon even easier. And when you compare this to Ruby and Sapphire, there was so much more to do. All the additional content like secret bases, Pokemon contests, and hunting down the Reggies were still in the game, but there was new features like soaring through the sky and finding mirage spots to find legendary Pokemon and rare items. And of course, the full post-game Delta episode where you get to go into space on Rayquaza and fight Deoxys. This was Hoenn fan service at its absolute best. And as someone who grew up absolutely addicted to the originals, I'm glad they changed enough here to make it feel like its own journey, while also paying an enormous amount of respect to the games that it was based on. And the only thing that is keeping this from being any higher on the list is that I just wish these games were more difficult. But even as they are, I still think that these are the best Pokemon games that were released on the 3DS. It genuinely pained me to put Diamond and Pearl so low on this list because of all of my nostalgia, but when you have a game as good as Pokemon Platinum that shows that Sinnoh can be really good, then it only makes sense that those games have to be lower because of all of their issues. Because Pokemon Platinum not only fixed a lot of the things that Diamond and Pearl got wrong, but it also added so much to the story that took it from good to fantastic. Of course, the biggest fixes here were both to the performance and to the structure of the game. On the performance side of things, this game runs a little bit faster than Diamond and Pearl. It's not a perfect fix, but it's definitely a much needed improvement. And on the structure of the games, it fixed the biggest problem Diamond and Pearl had by giving this an actual selection of Pokemon that are worth using. Now trainers like Volkner and Flint actually have teams that match their Pokemon type preference. And though it still had the same problem Diamond and Pearl had where there were a bunch of cool Pokemon that got evolutions from older titles that you really can't access until the post-game, when I replay Pokemon Platinum, I'm not forced to use the exact same team that I used the last time around. And though there weren't a ton added, the new additional Pokemon made this a much better experience for the average person. The Sinnoh region itself got a visual overhaul with more of a winter theme throughout the entire region, which is just a subtle change that doesn't fix anything gameplay-wise, but the new aesthetic is just so nice. But of course, the thing that everybody talks about with Pokemon Platinum is that the story got a much-needed improvement. Not only do you meet Cyrus way earlier in the game, they also changed the climax of the story to focus on Giratina instead of Dialga or Palkia. One of my biggest problems with Diamond or Pearl is unlike the earlier entries in the series, there was really no difference between the two in the story. Unlike Ruby and Sapphire, where there was a reason that each enemy team was using their specific Pokemon. Cyrus was going for whatever Pokemon was on the box of the game you were playing, which to the story did not matter at all. So here to get a focus on a specific Pokemon that ties into the story was already so much better. But this also allowed them to introduce the Distortion World, which is the best location that Pokemon has ever added to a game. Having these gravity-defying locations and an eerie atmosphere made this so memorable not only for fans of Sinnoh, but for fans of Pokemon as a whole. And no matter how many times I play it, whenever I get through the Distortion World and I see Giratina slowly approach me, I get goosebumps every time. Though it didn't fix everything, Pokemon Platinum changed enough about Diamond and Pearl to make the entire experience feel more memorable. And I am still holding out hope that someday we will get an official remake of Sinnoh that actually makes it feel like it was made in the modern era. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 are the only Pokemon games to have a number in their title, which is a detail that bothers me a lot more than it should. Now, instead of going for a deluxe version like they did with every other entry, this time they went for a direct sequel. And honestly, I wish they kept doing this because I love that they were able to flesh out the story even more. This takes place 2 years after Pokemon Black and White and brings you on a completely separate journey starting out on the other side of the world. They expanded the Unova region by adding new locations, taking you around it in a different order, and of course introducing characters both old and new to show that time had passed. And during those 2 years, a lot had happened. Of course, if you've played Black and White 2, you'll recognize characters like Sharon and Bianca, who are now living their lives as actual people. You start the game in an area that wasn't accessible in the last title, and now there are Pokemon that are available from other regions outside of just the Pokemon that were new in Unova. Of course, being a sequel, you are still dealing with Team Plasma because apparently they still exist. After the events of the first game, they fractured into 2 groups, with one group following Getsis, continuing to be the worst, and the other following N, who actually want to help Pokemon. As a sequel, I was pleasantly surprised with how good the story still was, even though it was being compared to Black and White. It would have been really easy for Pokemon to pick up and move on, or just do a deluxe version like they've done in the past. And though I don't think the story was as gripping, I also don't think it was bad. But considering we're in the top 4, what this had that makes it better than most other Pokemon games is the best battle system in the entire series. After this point, Pokemon has forced a battle gimmick into almost every single mainline title that usually work pretty well, but also make it really easy to blitz your way through the entire game. But here the gameplay is fast and fluid and doesn't overcomplicate things for the sake of a gimmick. And bringing in Pokemon from outside of the region was a great way to expand the options for team building, making this the best game for someone who only cares about battling, especially when you add in the Pokemon World Tournament, which is arguably the best post-game tournament a game in the series has had, not only allowing you to refight gym leaders from this region, but also from every region in the series past. This on its own was enough fan service to keep me and a lot of people coming back to this for a long time. And Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 were the perfect send-off for the DS era of Pokemon, and I don't think I've had as much fun with the Pokemon games since this time. After replaying all of the games, the biggest shock to me was that Pokemon Emerald moved down a substantial amount on the list. Now, to be fair, this is still my personal favorite game in the series, but I acknowledge that that is mostly nostalgia. But that being said, this is still the best deluxe version that Pokemon has ever made. With Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire both telling a slightly different story, Pokemon Emerald had a great opportunity. They were able to take the best elements from both games and put them together, making it so Team Magma and Team Aqua actually felt like they were at odds throughout the entire game, making it so you were stuck in the middle of 2 teams who were trying to fight it out to take over the world. Neither team was right, and both teams were led by people who were blinded by ambition. And having this change alone brought the story from good to fantastic. I wouldn't consider Team Magma or Team Aqua to be the best Pokemon villains, but when you put them together and have their directly conflicting ideologies come to battle, they easily took the Hoenn story from good to great. But that is not all they changed, because now that Team Magma and Team Aqua were at odds, so were Kyogre and Groudon. So the story has a focus on the 3rd legendary Pokemon, Rayquaza, who from this moment quickly went on to be a lot of people's favorite legendary Pokemon of all time. Mostly because he comes down from the sky just to yell at these 2 losers to shut up. But even outside of the story, if you were someone like me who had already played Ruby and Sapphire, there were still a bunch more reasons to play this version. A lot of the trainers and gym leaders either received new teams or got changed out altogether. The champion is no longer Steven Stone, it's Wallace. They turned Steven into a post-game battle and made him even more challenging to fight. And Pokemon contests got condensed down into one building, and they also created new battle tents to take their place. And these served as a perfect way to preview what would become the game's post-game, the Pokemon Battle Frontier.
I'm ashamed to admit this, but I really don't love this anymore. Nice, you nailed it.
I used to be a Division 1 defender of this game's Battle Frontier, but after revisiting it, outside of the area looking cool, I don't think it's fun. It does offer a ton of extra content that wasn't available in the earlier entries, but whenever I play it, I just get severe chest pain. It is needlessly complex and overly difficult to the point where it's really not even fun. I really wish they would have brought this back in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and streamlined the entire process. But as it stands, it was definitely better than what they had in Ruby and Sapphire, but just not by much. Ultimately, I think that Pokemon Emerald is the best version of Hoenn. It has by far the best version of the story and the most difficult gameplay for anyone to enjoy. And though it's a little bit dated by today's Pokemon standards, I do think this is the best of the older Pokemon titles. And though you may have to sell an organ to get it, it is a fantastic game. Replaying Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver reminded me how great this game really is. Everything that was great about Gold, Silver, and Crystal was brought to an entire new level. The visuals looked fantastic. The Johto region came alive like never before. and the additional content they added here made this feel like a substantial enough change from the original versions. Now the story is pretty much the exact same as it was in Crystal. There's still the whole side story where you have to deal with Eugene and Suicune, but the main story where you're dealing with Team Rocket was given a good amount more detail. The remaining Rocket admins got actual designs and names that made them feel like real characters. And though this was a subtle change, it was distinct enough to make this feel like an actual intentional story. But the things that made Heart Gold and Soul Silver shine was the pacing of the story and how much there was to do. You can get through all 16 badges in about 20 to 30 hours. Now of course, there is a lot to do outside of this, so if you want to, you could easily get hundreds of hours out of this. But if you're someone who just wants to get through the regions and battle your Pokemon, this is a great game to do so. This is also the first game since Pokemon Yellow to allow a Pokemon to follow you around. And this still looks so much better than it did in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Having the option for any of your Pokemon to follow you around was just such a little detail that added so much charm. You can talk to them and they can find items, and overall, it's really a nice touch. And of course, even when you're done getting all 16 badges, there is still a ton to do. The Battle Frontier is here for some reason. You don't have to do it, but it is there for people who want to. There's the Pokemon Battle with Red, which is one of the most iconic trainer battles in the entire series. I love when a game makes the final battle be against the protagonist from the last entry. You can explore locations in Kanto like Cerulean Cave and catch Mewtwo. And of course, you can go around and catch a bunch of legendary Pokemon from the series past. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver took a region that was already so substantial and made it even more so. It still did have some issues like the level curve and the game feeling a bit slow, but there is a reason that a lot of people look at this as the best Pokemon game to have ever released. And the only game that I think is slightly better is Pokemon Black and White.
You mean the game where everybody was forced to use those trash Pokemon? Hey, look at this guy stuck in 2011. Have fun playing Doodle Jump on your iPod Touch, loser.
At the time of release, people thought that these games were the worst things to ever happen to Pokemon. And I'm glad that a lot of people have realized that that is just not true. Generation 5 is where Pokemon really found its footing on the DS. The gameplay felt fantastic, especially compared to the earlier games that felt a little slow by comparison. The sprite work here is the best the series has ever seen, and the music throughout the entire game is absolutely fantastic. And the only thing holding back the core Pokemon gameplay is that you can only use Pokemon from this region.
So no Bellsprout?
Now, I'm someone who really likes a lot of the Pokemon that were introduced in this region, except for that one. But for the most part, these designs are really solid. Though I do think it was an overstep to make it so you can only use these Pokemon until the post-game, I understand they were trying to reboot the series and give people the same feeling that they had with Pokemon Red and Blue. So outside of the restrictive nature of the Pokemon selection, I think the gameplay here was fantastic. But the thing that made Pokemon Black and White so beloved was the story. Team Plasma is the most grounded Pokemon villain group that we have ever gotten. Their goal was to use propaganda and gaslighting to make people feel bad for capturing Pokemon, going as far as to raise a child with the ability to speak to Pokemon to believe that all Pokemon hate being captured, and was raised from a young age being introduced to Pokemon who have been neglected and abused. So he believed that this is how all Pokemon felt. So naturally, he made it his life's goal to free Pokemon from human captivity. All the while, this just fueled Ghetsis' ambition to be the only Pokemon trainer left in the region, so he could take it over and be the one true king. They weren't trying to reshape the world or completely destroy it and have it start again. They were just playing off people's emotions. And both as a Pokemon story and a story on its own, this is by far the best in the series. The region itself is a bit linear, but it's also full of a bunch of distinct looking locations. And I could go on and on for hours about why Pokemon Black and White are the greatest Pokemon games ever released. And though at the end of the day, I'll always prefer Pokemon Emerald for nostalgia, whenever someone comes up to me and asks what Pokemon game they should play first, this is usually the game that I recommend.
This isn't how I normally end videos, but wait, hang on. Much better. Now, this isn't how I normally end videos, but I just wanted to say thank you for 50,000 subscribers. I never thought we would reach 100, let alone 1,000, and then everything else has just been crazy. So from the bottom of my heart, I just wanted to say thanks for watching.